The words traveled through the crack in the study door, like a blade slipping between ribs, quiet and precise, and absolutely devastating. Isolde pressed her back against the hallway wall, her fingers still curled around the tea tray she had been carrying to her husband's study as a small kindness, a gesture she had rehearsed in her mind 3 times before committing to it. "She means nothing to me, Mother. The arrangement serves its purpose. When the purpose is fulfilled, the matter will resolve itself." His voice, Calloway's voice, the voice that had spoken vows to her 6 weeks ago in a chapel so cold, their breath had turned to fog between the words, "I do." That same voice, now carving her out of existence as casually as one might cross a name from a guest list. Isolde's hands began to tremble. The teacup rattled against its saucer, a tiny porcelain earthquake that seemed deafening in the silence of the corridor. She pressed the tray against her stomach to still it, the heat of the pot bleeding through her dress, burning her skin. But the pain felt distant, irrelevant. Nothing compared to the hollow expanding in her chest. Through the door, the Dowager Duchess responded, her voice carrying the particular crispness of a woman who had spent 60 years sharpening every syllable into a weapon. "Then why did you marry her, Calloway? If she means nothing, why go through the spectacle?" "Because you gave me no alternative." His chair creaked. Isolde could picture him leaning back, one hand dragging across his jaw, the way he always did when he was irritated. "You and the creditors, and this rotting estate. You told me to find a solution or watch Ashworth fall. I found a solution. She is the solution. Not a wife, not a partner. A solution." Silence. Then the Dowager again, softer now, almost careful. "And if she discovers that?" "She will not. Isolde is obedient. Quiet. She does what she is told, and asks nothing inconvenient. That is precisely why I chose her. Obedient. Quiet. Asks nothing inconvenient." Each word was a nail driven through the image Isolde had built of herself over 6 weeks of marriage. The image of a wife who was beginning to matter, beginning to be seen by a husband who was distant but not unkind. She had mistaken his courtesy for warmth. She had mistaken tolerance for the slow beginnings of affection. She had been wrong. The tea tray tilted. She caught it, but the small silver spoon slid free and hit the marble floor with a sound like a bell being struck in an empty church. The conversation behind the door stopped. Isolde did not wait. She turned and walked, not ran. Walked, because even now, even with her world cracking open beneath her feet, she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flee. Her shoes made no sound on the thick carpet of the East Corridor. She passed the portrait gallery, where 8 generations of Ashworth dukes stared down from gilded frames, their painted eyes following her with the same indifference their living descendant had just expressed. "She means nothing to me." The words played on a loop, each repetition stripping away another layer of the composure she wore like armor. By the time she reached her rooms, her vision was blurring, and her throat had closed around something too large and too sharp to swallow. She set the tea tray on the writing desk. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed both hands flat against the embroidered coverlet and breathed. In, out, in, out. She would not cry. Crying implied surprise, and some part of her, some quiet, honest, deeply buried part, had always known this was too good to be true. Girls like Isolde Merriweather did not marry dukes. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. They were borrowed, used, and eventually returned to the modest lives from which they had been plucked. She had simply allowed herself to forget that. She had allowed herself to hope. And hope, as her grandmother used to say, was the cruelest kind of debt, because it always came due at the worst possible moment. A knock at the door made her flinch. "Miss, Your Grace." It was Prentice, the young housemaid assigned to attend her. "Shall I draw your bath?" Isolde's voice came out flat, controlled, belonging to someone she did not quite recognize. Yes, Prentice, that would be lovely. She listened to the girl move through the adjoining room, the splash of water, the clink of bottles. Normal sounds, the sounds of a life that was supposed to be hers. She looked at the tea tray she had carried all the way from the kitchen herself because she had wanted, foolishly, stupidly, to do something with her own hands for the man she had married. The tea was cold now. It did not matter, did. Nothing about that small, hopeful gesture mattered anymore. But even as the ache settled into her bones, something else stirred beneath it. Not sadness, not resignation. Something sharper, something with teeth. Because Isolde Merriweather had grown up in a house where the roof leaked and the winters lasted forever, and she had learned very young that the difference between surviving and drowning was simply deciding which one you refused to do. She was not going to drown. Not here. Not because of him. She just needed to figure out what to do next. The marriage had begun, as so many disastrous things do, with a letter. 3 months before the wedding, Isolde had been sitting in the back room of her mother's millinery shop in the village of Thornfield, stitching silk flowers onto a bonnet she would never be able to afford, when her brother Soren walked in with an expression she had learned to distrust, the particular brightness in his eyes that meant he had found another scheme, another shortcut, another brilliant idea that would almost certainly end in catastrophe. He set a letter on the work table between them, thick cream paper, a wax seal she did not recognize, deep burgundy, pressed with a crest that featured 2 wolves flanking a shield. "Before you say no," Soren began. "I have not said anything. You are about to. Your left eyebrow does a thing." He sat across from her, pushing aside ribbons and hat forms. "Just read it, Isolde." "Please." She picked up the letter. The handwriting was not Soren's. It was precise and angular, each letter formed with the deliberate control of someone who had been taught penmanship as a discipline rather than a skill. The letter was addressed to Soren, but its contents concerned her. It was from a solicitor named Mr. Aldrich Vane, writing on behalf of His Grace, Calloway Ashworth, the 7th Duke of Ravensmere. The language was formal, circuitous, padded with legal courtesies, but stripped to its bones. The message was simple. The Duke required a wife, not a love match, not a society bride, not a woman of fortune or title. He required someone intelligent, presentable, and willing to enter a marriage of practical arrangement. In exchange, the Duke would settle all outstanding debts belonging to the bride's immediate family, provide a generous annual allowance, and ensure the comfort and security of her relations for the duration of the marriage. The solicitor had been directed to Mr. Soren Merriweather, whose acquaintance the Duke had made through certain business dealings, as a man who might know of a suitable candidate. Isolde read it twice. Then she looked at her brother. "You cannot be serious." "The debts, Isolde." Soren's voice dropped. His brightness dimmed into something rawer, more desperate. "Father's debts. The shop is 3 months behind on rent. Mother's eyes are failing. She cannot keep stitching at this pace, and the creditors are no longer sending letters. They are sending men. Men who stand outside the shop and wait. She knew. She had seen them, thick-shouldered and patient, leaning against the wall across the street, watching. Not threatening, not yet, but present. A reminder that debts did not disappear simply because the debtor had died and left behind a widow and 2 children who had nothing to sell. "Who is this Duke?" she asked. "Calloway Ashworth." Soren pulled his chair closer, leaning in as if someone might overhear them in the empty back room. "I met his man of business last year when I was trying to sell those shipping shares. The estate is called Ashworth Hall. Massive place in Harrowick, north of London. Old family, old title, old money. Only the money ran out about 10 years ago, and the current Duke has been trying to rebuild it. He needs a wife because his grandmother controls a trust that only releases funds upon his marriage. It is a condition of his late father's will. And he wants someone, nobody. Someone with no connections, no expectations, no power to complicate things. He wants someone manageable, Isolde said, her voice quiet. Soren flinched. He wants someone smart. I told his solicitor about you, and you told a stranger about me. You offered me up like... It is not like that. Then what is it like, Soren? Because from where I am sitting, it looks remarkably like you are selling your sister to pay your debts. Our debts. Our family's debts. The ones keeping Mother awake every night. The ones that will put us on the street by winter. He was not wrong. That was the worst part. He was not wrong about any of it. The debts were real. The creditors were real. Her mother's failing eyesight was real. The slow, grinding erosion of their lives since her father's death was real. And this letter, this absurd, insulting, impossible letter, was the first real solution anyone had offered. She looked down at the cream paper, at the burgundy seal, at the careful handwriting of a solicitor who dealt in transactions, not feelings. What does he look like? She asked, and immediately hated herself for caring. Soren relaxed, sensing an opening. He's not unpleasant. 34. Tall, dark hair, rather severe looking from what I've gathered, but not cruel. His staff speaks well of him. He's respected, if not exactly warm. Not exactly warm. That was a phrase that could cover anything from mildly reserved to emotionally barren. Isolde set the letter down and returned to her stitching, pulling the needle through silk with fingers that wanted to shake, but would not be permitted to. I need to think about it. Of course. Take your time. But Isolde, she looked up. There is not very much time. She thought about it for 4 days. 4 days of stitching bonnets and measuring ribbon, and pretending she did not see the men across the street. 4 days of watching her mother squint at needlework by candlelight because they could not afford enough lamp oil. 4 days of Soren hovering, trying not to pressure her and failing spectacularly. On the 5th day, she wrote a reply. Not to the solicitor, to the Duke himself. Sir, my brother has shared your solicitor's correspondence. I will not pretend to find this arrangement romantic or flattering. You need a wife to unlock a trust. I need security for my family. If we are to proceed, I require honesty. I have no interest in illusions. Yours, Isolde Merriweather. She expected no response, or perhaps a curt dismissal for her impertinence. Instead, 3 days later, a carriage arrived in Thornfield, bearing Mr. Aldrich Vane himself, who informed her with professional detachment that His Grace had read her letter and wished to meet her. The Duke, Mr. Vane said, appreciated directness. The meeting took place at an inn halfway between Thornfield and Harrowick, a neutral ground that felt more like a negotiation than a courtship. Calloway Ashworth was exactly as Soren had described. Tall, dark-haired, severe. He sat across from her at a private table with the posture of a man accustomed to authority and the expression of someone conducting an interview for a household position. He was handsome, she noticed with some irritation, the kind of angular, sharp-featured handsomeness that suggested he had never in his life needed to be charming because his face did the work for him. His eyes were gray, pale, and assessing, the color of winter rivers. You wrote that you have no interest in illusions, he said without preamble. His voice was low, measured, and carried the faint rasp of someone who did not use it for unnecessary conversation. I do not. Then I will be direct. I need a wife. Specifically, I need a wife before the autumn quarter, when the trust conditions must be satisfied. The marriage will be legal and binding, but its nature will be practical. I do not expect affection, and I will not pretend to offer it. In exchange, your family's debts will be cleared within the week of our wedding, and you will receive an annual income of your own. Your mother will be provided for. Your brother's situation will be stabilized. And what do you expect from me? Isolde asked. Compliance with the public expectations of a duchess, attendance at necessary social functions, civil behavior in front of my grandmother, who will be difficult, but must be managed. Beyond that, your time is your own. He said it as if he were describing the terms of a tenancy, not a marriage. Isolde studied him, looking for cruelty or contempt, and finding neither. Just a calm, calculated pragmatism that was somehow worse because it left no room for anything human. And if I want more than compliance? She asked. More? If I want to actually live in this marriage, to have a say in household decisions, to be treated as a partner rather than a contractual obligation. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. You are negotiating? You said you appreciate directness. I do. Then directly, I am agreeing to marry a stranger to save my family. The least I can expect is to be treated as a person rather than a line item in your estate accounts. Something shifted in his expression, too fast to read. You have spirit, Miss Merriweather. Whether that is an asset or a complication remains to be seen. Very well. You will have a voice in household matters. I will treat you with courtesy and respect, but I will not pretend to feelings I do not have. Is that acceptable? It should not have been. A wiser woman, a woman with options, would have walked away. But Isolde did not have options. She had a mother going blind, a brother drowning in debt, and a life that was slowly collapsing inward like a house with rotting beams. She extended her hand across the table. It is acceptable, Your Grace. He took it. His grip was firm, warm, and businesslike. No lingering, no suggestion of anything beyond the transaction they had just concluded. They married 5 weeks later in the chapel at Ashworth Hall. The ceremony was small. Soren stood as witness, looking both relieved and guilty. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensmere sat in the front pew, like a monument carved from disapproval, her silver hair pinned beneath a black lace cap, her gray eyes, the same pale shade as her grandson's but colder, fixed on Isolde with the intensity of a jeweler examining a questionable stone. There were no other guests, no flowers except what grew wild in the chapel yard, no music except the vicar's thin voice echoing off stone walls. Isolde wore a dress of pale ivory silk that the Duke's solicitor had arranged, simple, elegant, and borrowed. Everything about this moment was borrowed. The dress, the name she was about to take, the life she was about to enter. When Calloway slid the ring onto her finger, a plain gold band that felt heavier than it should, he met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. His expression was unreadable. Hers, she hoped, was equally so. That night, he showed her to a suite of rooms on the east wing. Yours, he said. Mine are in the west wing. If you need anything, the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, will attend to you. Good night, Miss Mary, he caught himself. Good night, Isolde. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sounded strange in his mouth, like a word in a language he was still learning. He turned and walked away down the long corridor, his footsteps measured and precise, and Isolde stood in the doorway of her beautiful empty rooms and wondered what exactly she had done. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of courtesy without warmth. 6 weeks of meals eaten in the echoing dining room, where conversation was rationed like wartime provisions. 6 weeks of Calloway disappearing into his study at dawn and emerging at dinner, polite, distant, and utterly impenetrable. She had tried. Small overtures, a question about the estate, a comment about the gardens, an offer to help with correspondence, since she had a clear hand and a sharp mind for organization. Each time he responded with perfect civility and absolute deflection. That is kind of you, but unnecessary. The gardens are managed by Hargrove. I have the correspondence well in hand. Thank you. She was a guest in her own marriage, tolerated and irrelevant, and she had been foolish enough to think that might be changing. There had been a moment, 3 days ago, when she entered the library to find him reading by the fire. He looked up and something crossed his face, surprise perhaps, or something softer. He did not ask her to leave. She sat in the opposite chair and read in silence, and for 20 minutes they simply existed in the same room without formality or performance. It had felt like progress. Like the first crack in a wall, she was slowly, patiently, learning to navigate. She had carried that feeling with her for 3 days, nurturing it like a flame cupped against wind, and then she had heard him through the study door. She means nothing to me, Mother. Standing now in her rooms, the cold tea still sitting on the writing desk, Isolde felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders. She was married to a man who considered her a transaction. She lived in a house where she was tolerated but not wanted. She had traded her freedom for her family's security, and the price was turning out to be higher than she had calculated. But she had made a deal. And Isolde Merriweather, now Isolde Ashworth, Duchess of Ravensmere, did not break deals. She did not run. She did not crumble. She sat very still on the edge of her borrowed bed in her borrowed life, and she began, quietly and methodically, to plan. Because if Calloway Ashworth thought she was obedient and quiet and nothing more, he was about to discover just how dangerously wrong a duke could be. The next morning, Isolde woke before dawn, not from habit, but from the particular restlessness of someone who has made a decision in the dark and now must face it in the light. She lay still for a moment, staring at the canopy above her bed, tracing the embroidered vines that curled across the silk like secrets whispering to each other. Then she rose, dressed herself without waiting for Prentice, and went downstairs. Ashworth Hall in the early morning was a different creature from the house she had come to know. Without the servants moving through it, without the dowager's presence pressing down on every room like a weather system, the place revealed itself. It was enormous, not merely large in the way that comfortable houses are large, but vast in the way that empires are vast, built to remind anyone standing inside it that they were small and the family who owned it was not. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed her mother's entire shop. The staircase swept upward in a curve of polished oak that gleamed like dark honey in the thin morning light. Portraits lined every wall, ancestors in powdered wigs and military uniforms, women in jewels that could have fed Thornfield for a decade. Isolde moved through it all slowly, deliberately, the way one might walk through a foreign country, noting landmarks and exits. She had lived here for 6 weeks, but she had not truly looked. She had been too careful, too conscious of her position, too busy trying to shrink herself into something that would not offend or intrude. She had taken meals in the dining room and retreated to her rooms. She had walked the same 3 corridors and avoided the rest. She had treated Ashworth Hall like a hotel where she was an uncertain guest, tiptoeing around the edges of a life she had been given no permission to fully inhabit. That ended today. She found the kitchens first, a massive stone-floored room in the basement level, warm with the residual heat of banked fires and smelling of bread dough and dried herbs. The cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Firth, looked up from her morning preparations with undisguised surprise. "Your Grace, is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong, Mrs. Firth. I wanted to see the kitchens." The cook blinked, as if the Duchess visiting her domain was roughly as expected as a horse wandering into the drawing room. "Well, here they are, Your Grace." Isolde looked around, taking in the copper pots, the long preparation tables, the pantry shelves lined with preserves. It was the most alive room she had encountered in this house. "Who plans the menus?" "I do, Your Grace." In consultation with Mrs. Dalton. I would like to be involved, Isolde said. Not to interfere, but to learn. I should know how this household runs. Mrs. Firth's expression shifted from surprise to something cautious, but not unfriendly. Of course, Your Grace. Whatever you wish. From the kitchens, Isolde explored methodically. The laundry rooms, where 3 women worked in clouds of steam. The still room, where medicines and cleaning preparations were mixed. The servants' hall, where the staff took their meals at a long pine table. The stables, where a groom named Wycliffe showed her the horses with quiet pride. The gardens, which she had glimpsed from windows but never walked through, sprawling and overgrown in some places, meticulously maintained in others. A patchwork of ambition and neglect that mirrored the estate itself. She found the library last, though it was the room she had been circling toward all morning. It was 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around the upper level and a rolling ladder attached to brass rails. The shelves were packed with thousands of volumes, spines cracked and faded. Some titles so old the gilt lettering had worn away entirely. It smelled of leather and dust and time. She pulled down a book at random, a treatise on agricultural reform, dated 1792, with notes scrawled in the margins in 3 different hands, 3 generations of Ashworth dukes arguing with each other across decades. She was reading the margin notes when a voice interrupted her. "You are up early." She did not startle. She had been half expecting him. Calloway stood in the doorway, dressed for riding, his dark hair still damp. His expression held the faintest trace of surprise, as though finding her in the library at 6 in the morning did not fit neatly into whatever category he had filed her under. "I could not sleep," Isolde said. She held up the book. "Your great-grandfather had very strong opinions about crop rotation." He did. He was also spectacularly wrong about most of them, which my grandfather took great pleasure in pointing out. He gestured at the margin notes. "That is their argument. It lasted 40 years. Isolde looked down at the cramped handwriting, 2 men debating across time, and felt something unexpected. Envy. They cared about this place, she said quietly, deeply. Whatever their disagreements, they loved Ashworth. Yes. Calloway's voice was neutral, but something tightened in his jaw. They did. He turned to leave, then paused without looking back. "Mrs. Dalton tells me you visited the kitchens this morning, and the laundry, and the stables. I am learning my household." It was a deliberate choice of words. My household. Not your household. Not the household. Calloway was silent for a beat too long. Then, without commenting, he left. It was a small victory, barely a skirmish, but Isolde held it close as she returned the book to its shelf and continued her exploration, because today was not about winning. Today was about refusing to be invisible. By the end of her first week of deliberate engagement, Isolde had memorized the names of every servant in Ashworth Hall. She knew that Prentice had a younger sister in service at a house in Bath. She knew that Wycliffe the groom had been with the family since Calloway's father's time and could predict weather better than any almanac. She knew that Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, ran the house with military precision, but softened visibly when discussing her late husband, who had been the previous Duke's valet. She knew that Mrs. Firth the cook made a blackberry jam so extraordinary that the village vicar had once offered to trade his best sermon notes for a jar of it. She knew the rhythms of the house, when the fires were laid, when the post arrived, when the dowager took her afternoon nap in the blue drawing room, with a novel she would deny reading if asked. She was building a map of this world, detail by detail, connection by connection. And in doing so, she was changing shape within it. She was no longer the silent, obedient bride who sat at the end of the dining table like an ornamental centerpiece. She was becoming something harder to ignore. The dowager noticed first. It happened on a Thursday. Isolde was reviewing the household accounts with Mrs. Dalton in the morning room, a task she had requested, and which the housekeeper had cautiously welcomed, when the door opened and the Dowager Duchess entered without knocking, because knocking was something other people did. "Leave us," the Dowager said to Mrs. Dalton. It was not a request. The housekeeper vanished with the speed of someone who had survived decades of this woman's authority by knowing precisely when to disappear. Isolde closed the account book, but did not stand. She had learned enough about the Dowager in 6 weeks to know that rising would be interpreted as deference, and deference would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness would be exploited without hesitation. The older woman settled into the chair across from her, with the controlled grace of a queen taking her throne. She wore black, as always, relieved only by a cameo brooch at her throat that Isolde recognized as exceptionally fine. Her silver hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the bones of her face. Her eyes, that pale, cutting gray that Calloway had inherited, fixed on Isolde with the focus of a surgeon deciding where to make the first incision. "You have been busy," the Dowager said. "I have been learning, Your Grace." Learning. The word was repeated as though it had an unpleasant taste. "You have been ingratiating yourself with the staff, rearranging menus, walking through the estate as though you own it." "I do own it," Isolde said quietly. "Or rather, I am married to the man who does, which by law and custom gives me a certain standing in this household. Whether that standing is welcomed or merely tolerated is, with respect, not the point." The Dowager's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of a reassessment. "My grandson married you because he needed a wife, not because he wanted one. You understand that. He has made it very clear, Your Grace." "Has he?" The Dowager leaned forward slightly. "And what do you intend to do about it?" Isolde met her gaze without flinching. "I intend to be useful. This estate is struggling. The accounts I have been reviewing tell a story of decades of decline, deferred repairs, reduced staff, entire wings closed off because there is no money to maintain them. Calloway is trying to reverse that, but he is doing it alone, and he is exhausted, and he will not ask for help, because asking for help would mean admitting vulnerability, and I suspect the men in this family would rather drown than admit they cannot swim." The silence that followed was so complete that Isolde could hear the clock on the mantelpiece ticking. Then the Dowager did something unexpected. She laughed. It was not a warm laugh. It was sharp and brief and carried the edge of genuine astonishment, like the sound a hawk might make if a mouse suddenly turned and bit it. "You are not what I expected," the Dowager said. "I rarely am. My grandson believes you are manageable, controllable. A quiet girl from a quiet village who will sit in her rooms and cause no disruption." Isolde's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice remained steady. "And what do you believe, Your Grace?" The Dowager studied her for a long moment. "I believe you are either exactly what this family needs, or exactly what will destroy it. I have not yet decided which." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "I will tell you what I told the last woman who sat where you are sitting, though the circumstances were different. My son's wife, Calloway's mother. What did you tell her? That this family consumes the women who marry into it. It demands everything and offers very little in return. Calloway's mother gave everything, her youth, her health, her happiness. She died in this house at 31, worn down by the weight of it. I watched it happen, and I did nothing because I believed the family mattered more than the individual. I was wrong." Isolde's breath caught. The confession was so unexpected, so raw, that it cracked through every defense she had built. The Dowager moved toward the door, then stopped. "I do not like you, Miss Merriweather." "Isolde, Your Grace." "My name is Isolde." "I do not like you, Isolde." But I did not like Calloway's mother either, and she turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to my son. Perhaps you will surprise me similarly. Perhaps I will simply watch you fail. Either way, I will be watching." She left. Isolde sat motionless for several minutes, her heart hammering, replaying every word. The Dowager had given her 3 things in that conversation: a warning about the cost of this family, an admission of past failure, and something that was not quite permission, but was no longer outright opposition. It wasn't kindness. It was not acceptance. But it was a door left slightly ajar, and Isolde intended to walk through it. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that was neither comfortable nor hostile, but something in between, a careful dance of proximity and distance that left Isolde perpetually off balance. She threw herself into the estate. The accounts became her domain, and she discovered she had a talent for numbers that years of managing her mother's shop had quietly cultivated. She found inefficiencies, redundancies, suppliers charging twice the market rate, because no one had bothered to renegotiate contracts in over a decade. She brought her findings to Mrs. Dalton first, then to the estate manager, a perpetually harried man named Corwin, who treated her suggestions with initial skepticism that dissolved into grudging respect when her first round of changes saved the estate £40 in a single month. Calloway noticed. He did not say so directly, because direct acknowledgement of her contributions would mean admitting she was more than the quiet, obedient solution he had described to his mother. But she saw it in the way his gaze lingered on the revised account books she left on his desk, in the way he paused outside the morning room when she was meeting with Corwin, listening without entering, in the way he stopped correcting servants who came to her with household questions instead of to him. He was ceding ground, slowly, grudgingly, almost unconsciously, but he was ceding it. Their evenings began to shift. It started with the library. Isolde continued her habit of reading there after dinner, and Calloway continued to work at his desk in the same room. For the first week, they occupied opposite ends of the space in silence, 2 planets in separate orbits. But silence between 2 people who share a room every evening has a way of changing texture. It moves from awkward to tolerable, to something that almost resembles companionship, the quiet understanding of 2 people who have agreed, without discussing it, that being alone together is preferable to being alone apart. On the 9th evening, Calloway spoke without looking up from his correspondence. "You reorganized the tenancy agreements. I reviewed them. Several were outdated. 2 contained terms that were actively unfavorable to the estate. Did Corwin approve your revisions?" "Corwin helped draft them. He has good instincts but lacks confidence. He defers to precedent, even when precedent is clearly wrong." Calloway set down his pen and looked at her. "That is a remarkably astute observation for someone who has been here less than 2 months." Isolde turned a page in her book. "I grew up watching my father run a business. He made every mistake it is possible to make, which gave me an excellent education in what not to do. What happened to his business? He trusted a partner who stole from him. By the time he discovered the theft, there was nothing left to save. He died owing money to half the county and believing he had failed his family." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. Are you? Or is that simply what one says?" The question hung between them. Isolde had not meant to echo the sharpness she had heard through his study door, but the words came out barbed, carrying 6 weeks of suppressed hurt. Calloway's eyes narrowed. He studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time, and was not entirely sure what to make of what he found. "I'm sorry," he repeated, and this time the words carried weight. She held his gaze for a beat, then returned to her book, but something had cracked open in the air between them, a hairline fracture in the wall he maintained so carefully. She could feel it the way one feels a change in weather, a shift in pressure, a warmth where there had been none. 2 days later, he asked her opinion on a land dispute with a neighboring estate. Not through Corwin, not through Mrs. Dalton. He came to her directly, standing in the doorway of the morning room with a document in his hand, and an expression that suggested he was mildly annoyed at himself for being there. The Haverston family claims this boundary has been there since 1760. Our records suggest otherwise, but the survey maps are contradictory. You have a mind for details. What do you see? She took the document. She studied the maps, cross-referenced the dates, found the discrepancy in under 10 minutes. A surveyor's error, compounded by 70 years of unchallenged assumption. Calloway leaned over her shoulder to see where she was pointing, and for a moment, his proximity stole her concentration entirely. He smelled of leather and ink and the faint sharpness of cold air, as though he had just come in from riding. His sleeve brushed her arm. She cleared her throat. The original survey misidentifies this stream as the boundary marker, but the 1760 deed references an oak tree that stood 40 yards further east. The tree is gone now, but if you check the parish records, there should be a notation of when it was felled, which would confirm the original boundary. He was looking at her, not at the map. His expression was guarded, but his eyes held something she had not seen there before. Curiosity, perhaps, or the unsettling recognition that the quiet, manageable wife he had contracted for was neither quiet nor manageable, and that this might not be entirely unwelcome. "Thank you," he said. "That is helpful." He took the document and left. Isolde pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed. This was dangerous. Not the land dispute or the boundary maps or the household accounts. This. The way her pulse quickened when he stood close. The way she found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor. The way his rare, reluctant attention made her feel more alive than any kindness she had ever received. "She means nothing to me, Mother." The words returned like a slap, and she straightened in her chair, rebuilding her composure like a mason repairing a wall. She was not falling for Calloway Ashworth. She was making herself indispensable. There was a difference. There had to be a difference. Because if there was not, if she allowed this growing warmth to become something more, she would be handing him the power to destroy her with 6 words he had already proven willing to say. That evening in the library, he asked her about her childhood, not with the clinical detachment of their first meeting, but with something approaching genuine interest. What was Thornfield like? Small, Isolde said, the kind of village where everyone knows your business and discusses it over tea. My mother ran a millinery shop. My father had a small trading business before it collapsed. We were comfortable once, then we were not, and the transition happened so quickly it felt like falling. You do not speak of your father often. There is not much to say that is not painful. He was a good man who made a bad choice, and the consequences outlived him. Calloway turned his pen between his fingers. My father was similar in some ways, a good man whose choices had consequences he did not anticipate. His investments in the mines were supposed to save the estate. Instead, they nearly finished it. This was more than he had ever shared. Isolde held very still, afraid that any sudden movement might startle him back behind his walls. How old were you when the money ran out? 14. Old enough to understand what it meant. Young enough to believe I could fix it. He smiled, and it was the saddest expression she had ever seen on a human face. I have been trying to fix it for 20 years. I am still trying. You are not alone in that anymore, Isolde said. The words came out before she could stop them, before she could weigh them for safety, before she could wrap them in the careful neutrality she had been maintaining for weeks. They hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and terrifyingly sincere. Calloway looked at her. Really looked. Not the assessing glance of a man evaluating an arrangement, but the open, searching gaze of someone who had been alone for a very long time and had just heard a sound he did not recognize. He opened his mouth, closed it, and returned his attention to his correspondence. But his hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady on the pen. And when she finally rose to retire for the evening, he said goodnight without looking up, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Isolde climbed the stairs to her rooms, with her heart in her throat, and the terrible, wonderful, dangerous certainty that something was changing. Whether it was changing for the better or hurtling toward catastrophe, she could not tell. But the wall between them had another crack in it tonight, and she was no longer certain she wanted to stop it from breaking. The Heroic Harvest Assembly was the most important social event in the county, and the Dowager informed Isolde of their attendance with the casual brutality of a general issuing marching orders. You will attend. You will be seen. You will represent this family adequately, or you will wish you had. It was not an invitation. It was a deployment. Isolde had never attended anything resembling a formal assembly. In Thornfield, the closest equivalent was the midsummer dance at the village hall, where the fiddler drank too much ale, and the schoolmaster's wife always fell asleep in her chair before 9. The Heroic Assembly was another species entirely. A ballroom lit by 300 candles, an orchestra rather than a single fiddler, women in silk and jewels, and men in tailored evening coats that cost more than her mother earned in a year. This was Calloway's world, the world she had married into but never been presented to, and everyone in it would be watching. Prentice helped her dress in a gown the Dowager had arranged, deep green velvet with ivory lace at the bodice, simple by the standards of the room she was about to enter, but more beautiful than anything Isolde had ever worn. Her dark hair was pinned up with borrowed combs. A single strand of pearls, also borrowed, lay against her throat. She looked in the mirror and saw someone she almost recognized, a woman who belonged somewhere elegant, somewhere bright. Almost. Calloway waited in the entrance hall. He wore black evening dress with the ease of someone who had been born into formality, and when Isolde descended the stairs, he looked up. For one unguarded second, his expression shifted. It was not admiration exactly. It was closer to recognition, as though he were seeing something he had known was there, but had refused to acknowledge. Then the mask returned. "You look well," he said. The Dowager nodded once, which Isolde was learning to interpret as the highest possible praise from a woman who distributed approval like a miser, distributing coins. The carriage ride was silent. Calloway sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the passing darkness beyond the window. The Dowager sat beside Isolde, radiating authority. No one spoke, but the tension was a living thing, pressing against the walls of the carriage like a held breath. They arrived. The assembly rooms blazed with light and noise. Isolde felt the shift the moment they entered, the subtle turning of heads, the recalibration of attention. The Duke of Ravensmere had brought his wife, the mysterious girl from nowhere, the one no one had met, the one everyone had been whispering about for weeks. Calloway offered his arm. She took it, hyper-aware of the warmth of him through layers of fabric, and they walked into the room together. Introductions came in a blur. Sir Ambrose Whitley and his wife, whose smile did not reach her eyes. The Haverston family, with whom Calloway had the boundary dispute, their politeness thin as paper. Mrs. Bracewell, the vicar's wife, who was genuinely kind and held Isolde's hand a moment longer than necessary, as if offering solidarity. And then, cutting through the crowd with the precision of a blade through silk, a woman Isolde had never seen, but instantly understood. Lady Margot Pemberton. She was tall, fair-haired, and beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished and deliberate and designed to be noticed. Her gown was rose-colored silk, cut lower than any other in the room, and she moved through the crowd with the absolute confidence of someone who had never in her life been told she did not belong. Her eyes found Calloway before she reached them, and the smile she gave him was warm, possessive, and entirely too familiar. "Your Grace." She curtsied, but the gesture was perfunctory, a formality between intimates rather than a greeting between acquaintances. "How wonderful to see you out in society again. It has been far too long. Calloway, Lady Margot," he said, and his voice held a careful neutrality that told Isolde everything she needed to know. This woman mattered, or had mattered, or wanted to matter again. "May I introduce my wife, Isolde?" Lady Margot's gaze swept over Isolde with the practiced efficiency of a woman cataloging every flaw. "Your wife?" "Yes. I had heard." She extended a gloved hand. "How delightful." "Isolde? What an unusual name." "It is old," Isolde said, taking the offered hand. "Like the estate. How charming." Lady Margot turned back to Calloway, dismissing Isolde as thoroughly as if she had ceased to exist. "I was hoping you might spare a dance this evening, Your Grace, for old time's sake." Isolde felt the words land like a stone, dropped into still water. Old times. There was history here, unspoken and potent, and she had walked into it blind. Calloway hesitated. It was brief, barely a fraction of a second, but Isolde caught it. The hesitation of a man standing between two worlds, the one he had chosen and the one he had left behind. "I am afraid my first dances are spoken for this evening," he said, "but perhaps later." Lady Margot smiled. "Of course. I will hold you to that." She glided away, trailing whispers in her wake. Isolde waited until they were out of earshot. "Who is she?" "An acquaintance. Do not insult me with vague answers. Not here. Not tonight." Calloway's jaw tightened. "Lady Margot Pemberton. Our families have known each other for years. My grandmother favored a match between us before my father's death, complicated the estate finances." "She was the intended bride," Isolde said flatly. "Before you needed a wife with no expectations and no complications. Before you needed me." Calloway looked at her, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded passed across his face. It was gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said, "before I needed you." The orchestra began a waltz. Calloway extended his hand. "We should dance. People are watching." "Of course," Isolde said, taking his hand with a smile that cost her everything. "We would not want to disappoint the audience." They took the floor. His hand settled at her waist, her palm pressed to his, and the room contracted to the space between them. She had learned to waltz as a girl, taught by her mother in their small parlor, with a broom for a partner and a hummed tune for music. This was different. This was his hand guiding her, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. His gray eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her dizzy. "You are trembling," he observed. "I am furious," she said through her smile. "Ah, at me or at Lady Margot?" "At you. Always at you. You brought me into this world without warning me what I would find here. I did not think it mattered. Everything matters." She let him turn her, let the music carry them. "You said I was a solution. Solutions do not have feelings. They do not get jealous. They do not care who danced with whom before they existed. Is that what this is? Jealousy? That is what this should not be. Because I am not supposed to matter to you, and you are not supposed to matter to me. But here we are, and Lady Margot is watching us like she already knows the ending of a story I have not been told." His grip tightened at her waist, not painfully, but with the urgency of someone catching something they had not realized they were dropping. "Margot is the past," he said. "She was my grandmother's choice, never mine." The waltz ended. They separated with perfect formality. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace," Isolde said. He bowed over her hand. The pleasure was mine. It was performance, every word of it. So why did his voice sound like it was breaking? The rest of the evening was an endurance test. Isolde danced with Sir Ambrose, who trod on her toes. She made conversation with Mrs. Bracewell, who was kind. She smiled at strangers, who assessed her openly and found her wanting. And she watched Lady Margot orbit Calloway like a satellite that refused to accept it had been detached. They did dance, later in the evening. Isolde watched from across the room as Lady Margot laughed at something Calloway said, her hand resting on his arm a moment too long, her body angled toward his with practiced intimacy. He did not pull away. It was Calloway's sister who found her. Isolde had not known he had a sister until that moment, which told her how thoroughly she had been kept at arm's length. A young woman appeared at her elbow, dark-haired and sharp-featured like her brother, but with a warmth in her hazel eyes that he completely lacked. She was perhaps 20, dressed in pale blue, and she was looking at Isolde with undisguised curiosity. "You are her," the sister said. "The wife." "You must be the sister no one told me about," Isolde replied. Honoria, she stuck out her hand like a man and shook Isolde's firmly. "I have been in Bath with our aunt. Just arrived this afternoon. Sebastian told me absolutely nothing about you, which means you are either terrible or interesting. And since you do not look terrible, I am hopeful." "Sebastian? His middle name. I refuse to call him Calloway. It sounds like a species of bird." Isolde laughed. She could not help it. The sound surprised her. Honoria beamed. "Oh, good. You laugh. He needs someone who laughs. He's over there being tormented by Margot, I see. That woman is relentless." "Were they?" Isolde began. Together, Honoria's expression grew careful. She wanted them to be. Grandmother wanted them to be. I do not think Sebastian ever quite wanted it himself. But Margot is very skilled at making people forget what they actually want. A pause. Do not let her rattle you. She is impressive, but shallow, like a very beautiful puddle. The orchestra struck up another set. Honoria squeezed her hand. "Come to the house tomorrow. I want to know everything about you that my brother has failed to mention, which is apparently everything." She disappeared into the crowd, and Isolde felt something loosen in her chest, the first tendril of genuine connection in this alien world. But the loosening was short-lived, because later, as the evening wound down and guests began departing, Isolde slipped out to the terrace for air and found Lady Margot waiting like a trap that had been set with patience and precision. "You seem overwhelmed," Lady Margot said, her voice dripping sympathy. "These events can be taxing for those unaccustomed to them." "I am managing, thank you." Lady Margot leaned against the stone balustrade. "Of course you are. You are quite resourceful. Everyone says so. One has to be, coming from where you come from." Isolde said nothing. She had learned from her mother that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon available. "You should know," Lady Margot continued, her voice dropping to something intimate and poisonous, "that Calloway and I have an understanding. We have had one since we were young. This marriage of his, this arrangement, it changes nothing between us. He did what he had to do for the estate. Everyone understands that. But arrangements end. And when this one does, things will return to what they were." Isolde's hands were cold. Her chest ached, but she kept her voice even. "If your understanding with the Duke is so secure, Lady Margot, I wonder why you feel the need to explain it to me at a party." The other woman's expression hardened. "Because I want you to understand your position. You are a placeholder. Enjoy the dresses and the title while they last, but do not mistake proximity for permanence. And do not," she stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the night air, "make the mistake of falling in love with him. It would be terribly inconvenient for everyone, Isolde met her eyes. "Thank you for the advice, Lady Margot. I will give it exactly the consideration it deserves." She walked past her, back into the ballroom, back into the noise and light and judgment, and she did not let her face break until she was safely inside the carriage, where she turned her head toward the window and pressed her burning eyes against the cold glass. In the seat across from her, Calloway watched. She could feel his gaze, but refused to meet it. When they arrived home, she went directly to her rooms without speaking to anyone. That night, she did not go to the library. 3 days passed. Isolde buried herself in estate work with a ferocity that alarmed even Mrs. Dalton. She reorganized the linen inventories. She drafted new supplier contracts. She walked the tenant farms with Corwin, listening to complaints and taking notes with methodical precision. She did not go to the library. She did not seek Calloway's company. She rebuilt her walls, brick by brick, mortaring each one with the memory of his words through the study door and Lady Margot's poisonous confidence on the terrace. On the third evening, Calloway came to find her. She was in the morning room, working by candlelight because the fire had burned low, and she had not noticed. He stood in the doorway, and she could feel him there without looking up, the particular weight of his presence that she had become attuned to against her will. "You have been avoiding me. I have been working. That is not what I said." She set down her pen. "What would you like, Your Grace?" He flinched at the formality. The tiny recoil was almost invisible, but she saw it and hated herself for the satisfaction it gave her. He crossed the room and placed something on the desk beside her. It was a small leather-bound journal, old and slightly battered, with a clasp shaped like a leaf. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She kept it during the first year of her marriage. I found it in the library after she died. I have never shown it to anyone." Isolde stared at the journal without touching it. "Why are you showing it to me?" "Because she wrote about what it felt like to arrive here, a stranger in a strange house, married to a man she barely knew, surrounded by people who viewed her as an intruder. She wrote about loneliness and doubt and the slow, terrifying process of learning to belong somewhere that did not want her." He paused. "I thought you might understand." Her throat closed. She picked up the journal with careful hands, feeling the weight of it, the history embedded in the worn leather. "This is not a small thing, Calloway." "No, it is not." She opened the first page. The handwriting was delicate and slightly slanted, the script of a woman writing quickly, privately, for no audience but herself. The first entry was dated 23 years ago. "I arrived at Ashworth today. The house is beautiful and terrible. My husband is kind, but distant. His mother watches me as though she is waiting for me to fail. I think she might be right to wait." Isolde's eyes blurred. Calloway was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face, something between fear and hope, as though he had handed her a weapon and was waiting to see if she would use it or lay it down. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, turned, and left. But this time his departure felt different, not like a retreat, like a man who had taken a step off a cliff and was waiting to see if he would fall or fly. Isolde read the journal that night. Every word. Calloway's mother, a woman named Elspeth, had written with painful honesty about her first year at Ashworth Hall. The loneliness, the dowager's coldness, the slow, difficult thawing of a husband who had been raised to view emotion as weakness, and gradually, page by page, the cautious emergence of love, not the dramatic, consuming love of novels, but something quieter and harder earned, built from shared silences and small courtesies, and the daily choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The last entry read, "He told me today that I make this house bearable. It is not poetry. It is not a declaration. But it is his, and he meant it, and I think that might be enough." Isolde closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. She thought of Calloway's face when he handed it to her, the vulnerability he had tried so hard to hide, the gift of his mother's most private thoughts, offered without explanation, because some things could not be explained. They could only be felt. She was in trouble. Deep, irreversible, heart-stopping trouble. Because she was falling in love with a man who had told his mother she meant nothing. And the worst part was, she was beginning to believe he might have been lying. The next morning, everything shattered. Isolde came downstairs to find the entrance hall in unusual commotion. Prentice was hovering near the stairs, her expression tight with anxiety. Mrs. Dalton was speaking in urgent, hushed tones with one of the footmen. And from the drawing room came voices, raised in a way she had never heard in this carefully controlled house. She entered without knocking. The dowager stood by the fireplace, her face white with fury. Calloway stood opposite her, rigid as a blade, his hands clenched at his sides. Between them, seated on the settee with the perfect composure of a woman who had orchestrated exactly this moment, was Lady Margot Pemberton. Ah, Lady Margot smiled. The wife arrives. How timely. What is happening? Isolde looked from Calloway to the dowager. No one answered. What is happening? She repeated, and this time her voice carried the steel she had been sharpening for weeks. Lady Margot has informed me, the dowager said, her voice shaking with controlled rage, that she and my grandson have maintained a private understanding throughout his marriage. That his marriage to you was a financial necessity and nothing more. And that she expects, when the trust conditions are fully satisfied, that the arrangement will be quietly dissolved. Isolde's vision narrowed. She looked at Calloway. Is this true? He opened his mouth, but Lady Margot spoke first. Darling, there is no need to be cruel about it. We all knew the terms. The Duke needed a wife for the trust. He found one. The matter is nearly concluded. I am simply suggesting we begin planning for what comes next. Isolde ignored her. She kept her eyes on Calloway. Is this true? His face was ashen. It is not. There is no understanding. There has never been. Margot is. He means nothing by that, Lady Margot interrupted smoothly. He has always been protective. It is one of his more endearing qualities. But you must understand, Miss Merriweather, that your position here was always temporary. Isolde felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not because of Lady Margot, whose cruelty was transparent and therefore manageable, but because Calloway's face held something she had not expected. Guilt. Not the guilt of a man caught in a lie. The guilt of a man who knew that once, not long ago, he had said words in this very house that gave Lady Margot's claims their power. She means nothing to me, Mother. He had said it. He had meant it, or thought he did. And now those words, spoken in what he believed was privacy, had become the foundation of someone else's campaign to remove her. I see, Isolde said. Her voice was calm. Her hands were not. She clasped them behind her back to hide the trembling. If your grace will excuse me. Isolde, Calloway started toward her. No. She held up one hand, and the gesture stopped him as effectively as a wall. Not now. You do not get to fix this with words right now. She turned and walked out of the drawing room with her back straight, and her chin level, and her heart breaking into pieces so small she was not sure they could ever be reassembled. She packed methodically. Not everything. Not the gowns the dowager had arranged, or the jewelry she had been lent for the assembly. She packed her own things, the few items she had brought from Thornfield, the dress she had arrived in, her mother's sewing kit, a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. She packed Elspeth's journal because Calloway had given it to her, and she could not leave it behind. It was the one thing in this house that had been truly hers. Prentice stood in the corner, tears streaming silently down her face. Please, your grace, do not leave. Not like this. Tell Mrs. Dalton I am grateful for her kindness. Tell Corwin the supplier contracts are in the second drawer of the morning room desk. He will know what to do with them. And tell—" She stopped. She had been about to say, "Tell him. Tell Calloway." But there was nothing left to tell him that her leaving would not say more clearly than words. Prentice nodded miserably. Isolde left through the servants' entrance because she could not bear to walk past the drawing room again. She hired a cart from the village and sat in the back among sacks of flour and dried goods, wearing her old dress, carrying her small bag, watching Ashworth Hall grow smaller behind her until the road curved and the house disappeared behind a line of ancient elms. She did not cry. There would be time for that later. Right now, she needed to survive the journey home, and surviving was what Isolde Merriweather did best. Home was exactly as she had left it. The shop with its window display of bonnets no one was buying. The rooms above it, small and clean, and smelling of lavender and soap. Her mother at the work table, squinting at stitchwork in the fading afternoon light, the creak of the floorboards, the tick of the mantel clock, the smallness of everything. "Isolde," her mother said, rising. She did not ask why. She took one look at her daughter's face and simply opened her arms. They stood like that for a long time. In the days that followed, Isolde tried to rebuild her old life. She took over the shop accounts, which Soren had mismanaged in her absence. She stitched bonnets and arranged window displays and swept the floors and boiled tea, and did all the things she had done before Ashworth Hall, before Calloway, before the borrowed life that had almost convinced her she could be someone else. But the old life did not fit anymore. It was like putting on a dress she had outgrown, the seams pulling, and the fabric tight across the shoulders. She moved through her days efficiently and emptily, and at night, she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a library with a rolling ladder and a fire in the hearth and a man who worked too late and sometimes, rarely, smiled at her like she was the only real thing in his world. On the 5th day, her mother sat her down. "You love him," she said. It was not a question. "It does not matter," Isolde replied, "is the only thing that matters. He said I meant nothing to him." "Did he say it to you?" "He said it to his mother. I heard it through a door." "And did you ask him why?" "There was no why. It was the truth. His truth at that moment, perhaps. People say things to their mothers that they would never say to anyone else. Things shaped by obligation and pride, and the desperate need to appear in control. Your father once told his mother he regretted marrying me. I was standing in the next room. I heard every word." Isolde stared at her. "What?" He said it because his mother was pressing him about money, about his failures, about providing for us. He said he regretted it because admitting he loved me would have meant admitting he had failed the person he loved most. Men say terrible things when they are afraid, Isolde, especially to their mothers. It does not make the words true. But he— Listen to me." Her mother took her hands. "Did he ever treat you as though you meant nothing?" Isolde thought of the journal, Elspeth's journal, pressed into her hands with an expression that looked like surrender. She thought of the library evenings, the quiet conversations, and the way he had begun to seek her opinion, to lean on her judgment, to look at her with something that wasn't indifference and was not obligation and wasn't nothing. "No," she whispered. "He did not." "Then perhaps," her mother said gently, "you should consider the possibility that what you overheard was a man lying to the one person he has never been able to be honest with." Isolde was still turning her mother's words over in her mind the next morning when Honoria arrived. Not by carriage. On horseback, her hair half undone, her riding habit splashed with mud, looking as though she had ridden through the night, because she had. She burst into the shop like a weather event, startling Isolde's mother so badly that a box of hat pins crashed to the floor. "You left," Honoria said, breathless and furious, and radiating the particular energy of a young woman on a mission. "You left, and he is falling apart, and you have to come back." "How did you find me?" "He told me." "Well, he did not tell me exactly. He threw a paperweight at the wall, and then told me, which is the same thing in his language." Honoria grabbed her hands. "Listen, Margot is a liar. She always has been. There was never an understanding between them, not a real one. She wanted it. Grandmother encouraged it. But Calloway never agreed. He never even considered it. She manufactured the entire scene to drive you away, and it worked. Because he said I meant nothing. He said that to Grandmother weeks ago, before the assembly, before the library, before any of it. He said it because that is what Grandmother needed to hear to stop pressuring him about the marriage. He was protecting the arrangement, protecting you by claiming you did not matter so that Grandmother would stop trying to undermine you." Isolde's legs weakened. She sat down on the shop stool. "That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense if you know him. He solves problems by controlling information. He tells people what they need to hear to achieve the outcome he wants. He told Grandmother you meant nothing, because if she believed that, she would stop scheming against you. He did not anticipate that you would hear it, or that Margot would use it." Honoria's expression softened. "He is wretched, Isolde. I've never seen him like this. He has not eaten in 3 days. He dismissed Margot from the house and told Grandmother that if she ever allows that woman past the front door again, he will close Ashworth Hall and move to the continent." He said that? He also said, and I'm quoting directly, that he has made the worst mistake of his life, and that he deserves whatever comes of it, which is dramatic even for him. Isolde pressed her hands to her face. He could have told me. He could have explained. He could have trusted me with the truth instead of performing for his mother while I stood on the other side of the door. Yes, he could have, and that is what you need to tell him. Honoria pulled her gently to her feet. "Come back. Not for the house, or the title, or the arrangement. Come back because he needs you, and you need him. And this stubborn, terrified, emotionally incompetent man is in love with you, whether he knows how to say it or not." Isolde looked at her mother, who nodded. "Go," her mother said. "Go home." Home. The word broke something open inside her, because home was not supposed to be a crumbling estate in Harrowick, with leaking roofs, and a difficult grandmother, and a husband who expressed his deepest feelings by throwing paperweights at walls. But it was. Somehow, impossibly, it was. She changed into the green velvet dress she had taken from Ashworth, the one she had worn to the assembly, because if she was going back as herself, not as the girl from the millinery shop, not as the obedient solution, but as the Duchess of Ravensmere. She rode back with Honoria. They barely spoke. The countryside passed in a blur of green and gold, autumn beginning to thread through the trees like a warning that time was passing and would not wait for anyone to sort out their feelings. Ashworth Hall came into view as the sun was setting. The creamstone turned amber in the dying light. It looked different now. Not foreign. Not intimidating. It looked like a place that was waiting for her, a house that had been holding its breath. Calloway was not in the study. He was not in the library. He was in the garden, standing beneath the copper beech tree that his mother had planted the year she married into the family. Honoria had told her about the tree during the ride, how Elspeth had planted it as an act of faith, as proof that she intended to stay, that she would put down roots in this difficult soil and grow. He did not hear Isolde approach. He was standing with his hands at his sides, staring at the tree, and he looked exactly as Honoria had described. Wretched. Hollow. Like a man who had systematically dismantled the one thing that mattered and was only now surveying the wreckage. She stopped 10 feet away from him. "She means nothing to me," she said. Her voice carried across the garden, clear and sharp as a bell. He turned. The expression on his face when he saw her was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Shock, relief, agony, hope, all of it crashing together like waves meeting from opposite directions. "Isolde. Those are the words I heard through your study door 6 weeks into our marriage." She stepped closer. "Those are the words Lady Margot used to justify her claim on you. Those are the words that sent me back to Thornfield believing I was exactly what you contracted for. A solution, a line item, a nothing." His face crumpled. "Isolde, I am not finished." She held up her hand, and he fell silent. "When I married you, I expected nothing. You were honest about that, at least. You told me it was practical, transactional, temporary in spirit, if not in law. And I accepted that because my family needed saving, and I was out of options. But then you handed me your mother's journal, and you asked my opinion on land disputes, and you sat in the library with me every evening and slowly, word by careful word, let me see the man behind the title. And I made the catastrophic mistake of believing that maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to matter." Her voice cracked. She steadied it. "Honoria tells me you said those words to protect me, that you were managing your grandmother, controlling information, solving the problem the way you solve every problem, by deciding alone what everyone else needs to know." She was close enough now to see the sheen in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands trembled at his sides. "That has to stop," she said. "You do not get to decide what I can handle. You do not get to protect me by erasing me. If this marriage is going to be real, if there is any chance that this becomes something more than an arrangement, then I need to be in the room when decisions are made, not on the other side of the door, not hearing about my own irrelevance through a crack in the wall. In the room, with you, as your partner." His voice, when it came, was wrecked, rough and broken and stripped of every defense he had ever constructed. "You are not irrelevant. You were never irrelevant." "Isolde, I said those words to my mother because I was terrified. Not of her, not of the estate, not of the creditors. Of you. Of what I was beginning to feel. Of the fact that I married a stranger to unlock a trust fund, and somehow, against every rational expectation, that stranger became the only person in my life I cannot bear to lose." She was crying. She did not care. "And when I heard you had gone, when Prentice told me, when I walked into your empty rooms and saw that you had taken the journal but left everything else, I understood. You took the only thing I had given you that was real. Everything else was borrowed. And you knew it. You always knew it." She tried to speak. He crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands. "I love you." The words fell from him like a confession torn from someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to confess. "I love you, and I am terrible at it, because I have never done it before. And my only example was a mother who died before I could know her, and a father who buried his grief so deep it poisoned everything. But I love you, imperfectly and clumsily, and far too late. And if you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life getting better at it." She kissed him. Not gently, not carefully. She kissed him the way you kiss someone when you have been drowning, and they are air, desperate and fierce, and full of every word she had swallowed for weeks. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, with a force that left no room for doubt, or distance, or the careful propriety that had defined every interaction between them until this moment. When they finally pulled apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, she whispered. "If you ever tell anyone I mean nothing to you again, I will dismantle your estate accounts so thoroughly it will take you a decade to sort them out." He laughed. The sound was raw and startled and beautiful. The laugh of a man who had forgotten he knew how. "Understood," he said. "Thoroughly and completely understood." They found the dowager in her sitting room. She was waiting. Of course she was waiting. She had probably been waiting since Honoria left for Thornfield, calculating outcomes and preparing responses for every possible scenario, with the strategic mind that had kept this family afloat through 3 generations of financial disaster. "Grandmother," Calloway said. He held Isolde's hand. He did not let go. "Before you speak, I need to tell you something." The dowager's eyebrow rose. "I have lied to you. When I told you Isolde meant nothing, I was lying. I said it because I thought it was what you needed to hear to stop interfering, to stop scheming with Margot, to stop treating my marriage as a variable in your calculations. I was wrong, not about your scheming, which was relentless, but about the lie, because Isolde is not nothing. She is the reason this estate has saved £40 in 2 months. She is the reason the tenancy agreements are finally updated. She is the reason Corwin is doing his job properly for the first time in a decade. She is the reason I can breathe in this house." The dowager looked at Isolde. "Is that true?" "The £40 is accurate," Isolde said. "I have the accounts to prove it." The dowager's lips twitched. Something almost like warmth. She stood and crossed to them. "I owe you an apology," she said to Isolde. "I allowed Lady Margot into this house knowing her intentions. I did not create the situation, but I didn't prevent it. That was wrong." "You believed she was the better match," Isolde said. "I believed she was the easier match. There is a difference. Easier does not challenge. Easier does not plant roots. Easier does not reorganize the supplier contracts and save this family from its own incompetence." She placed one hand on Isolde's cheek. The gesture was so unexpected that Isolde nearly flinched. "You remind me of Elspeth. She was inconvenient, too. And she was the best thing that ever happened to this family. Do not tell Calloway I said that. I would not dream of it, Your Grace." "Good. Now stop making me sentimental. It is unbecoming at my age." The heroic winter ball was the social event that marked the close of the county season, and everyone was watching the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere. Isolde stood in the entrance of the assembly rooms, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that the dowager had commissioned from the finest dressmaker in London. Not borrowed. Hers. "You look magnificent," the dowager had said tartly, adjusting the sapphire necklace she had clasped around Isolde's throat. An Ashworth family piece, worn by every duchess for 4 generations. Try not to let it go to your head. Below them, the ballroom glittered. And there, waiting at the foot of the stairs, was Calloway. He looked up at her, with an expression that held nothing back. No mask, no calculation, no careful neutrality. Just love. Open and raw, and terrified, and brave. The same gray eyes that had assessed her across an inn table months ago now looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "No," she said. "But I am doing it anyway." He smiled. They descended together. The whispers started immediately, as they always did. But tonight they had a different quality. Less scandal, more curiosity. The Duchess who had vanished and returned. The Duke who had publicly dismissed Lady Margot Pemberton from his home. The marriage that everyone had written off as a financial arrangement, and which now, by all appearances, was something else entirely. Calloway led her to the center of the floor. The music began. He pulled her into a waltz, and this time she did not tremble. "You told me once that I was a solution," she said as they turned. "I remember." "And now?" "Now," he said, pulling her closer than propriety allowed, his mouth near her ear. You are everything. They danced, and around them, the world watched and whispered and wondered. But Isolde did not hear any of it. She heard only the music and the steady beat of her husband's heart, and the quiet certainty that she had found, against all odds and expectations, exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Isolde was cataloging books in the library when she found it. A letter, tucked into the pages of a volume on estate law that Calloway's father had clearly used often, the leather worn smooth at the spine. The letter was addressed to Calloway, but had never been opened. She brought it to him that evening. He opened it with careful hands. My dear son, if you are reading this, the estate is in worse shape than I hoped, and you are doing what I could not, holding it together through will and sacrifice. I am sorry for that burden, but I am more sorry if you have inherited my other failing, the belief that strength means carrying everything alone. Your mother taught me otherwise. She taught me that letting someone in is not weakness. It is the bravest thing a man can do. I was too proud to learn that lesson quickly, and I lost years with her that I will never recover. Do not make my mistake. Find someone brave enough to stand beside you, and then, for the love of everything good, let them. Your loving father. Calloway read it twice. Then he set it down and pulled Isolde into his arms. Thank you, he said, for finding this, for staying, for being brave enough to stand beside me even when I gave you every reason not to. She pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. You know, she said, I think your father and your mother would have liked me. My mother did not like anyone. That is what the Dowager says too, and yet here I am. Here you are, he agreed, exactly where you belong, and in a crumbling estate in Harrowick, with leaking roofs and a formidable grandmother and a library full of arguing ancestors. The Duke of Ravensmere held his wife and understood, finally and completely, that she had never meant nothing. She had meant everything. He had simply been too afraid to say it. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that demands honesty over performance, in characters who refuse to be erased by the people who should see them most clearly, in the courage it takes to stay when leaving would be easier, and the greater courage it takes to come back. If this story moved you, I would love to hear which moment stayed with you. Your thoughts and engagement shape what comes next. Consider subscribing if you want more stories of love that is earned, not given, of women who refuse to be nothing, of men brave enough to admit when they are wrong. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Until next time.